Welcome to the TST seminar on what you don't know about fluids. Originally this seminar was developed by Jim Holderman and Tom Birch. Jerry Trulia, Craig Trulia, and myself modified it. And what we'll be going over today is first engine oils and secondly coolants. Alright, engine oils. Obviously we have a lot of material to cover here. Gasoline engines and diesel engines. Topics to be discussed. Types of oils. API grades. SAE grades. ILSAC specs. ACEA specs. And the OE specifications, GM, Ford, BMW, Volkswagen, and so forth. Translation, a quick guide to using the correct oil. Alright, this Mobil 1 can here looks like a good oil. Is it? Just because it's Mobil 1, synthetic or anything else, does not mean it's good for the vehicle that you're currently working on. Motor oils always have to meet proper viscosity, but they have to as well meet manufacturer specifications. What's missing from this picture? Motor oil should be rated at least SM nowadays, not SL anymore. SN is out as well. We want to see the spec right here on the back of the can or bottle. And spec is SN spec has been unveiled. It's been out in a few brands, as you can read on this slide here. So you're looking at that, and again, you want to look at the SAE, the API spec. Then you want to look for manufacturer-specific specifications. In this case, GM, Ford, Chrysler, and Honda. What's missing here is a BMW spec or a Volkswagen spec.
I have a question, Pierre. That ILSAC GF4, is that the highest spec?
No, that's not the highest spec anymore. We have GF5 now.
Thank you.
But it was the spec on that. Now, there was some documentation recently that some GF5 oils have been rated GF4 only because they didn't have enough labels for the new stuff. You have to go by the label. You can't trust that they meet the higher spec, because somebody told you that.
Could I use that oil in a Volkswagen or Mercedes?
Not if you don't want engine damage.
But how would I know which one to use?
You have to look for the manufacturer spec on the can. We're going to get into that in a little while.
Thank you.
Alright, this oil here is a 520, but it only meets two manufacturer specs. This Ford spec, and by the way, manufacturers have different specs. And this says Ford WSS M2C930A. It has to be that spec for whatever Ford you have. Same with Chrysler. Chrysler MS6395. There are multiple specs manufacturers have. As a rule, and we all know rules are made to be broken, the newer spec is backwards compatible with it covers the older spec, but that's not always 100% true. Alright, there are, technically this is my way of presenting it, but the gasoline engines are S. I always say it's for spark, it's technically not right, and the diesels are for C for compression. That's my way of remembering it. Technically, it's not actually the nomenclature, but as long as you know that an S-spec oil is for a spark ignition engine and a C-rated oil is for a diesel engine, you'll be looking at the right number. So, SA and SJ are the older and now obsolete ratings. SL 2001 to 2003, SM 2004, and we now have SN. I guess it's not fully implemented at this point, but it's coming. It's going to be out in every brand pretty soon. Diesels, we have CA to CC. They're basically the old ones. Current ratings are CF4 for 4-cycle. That's the kind of the major one that's out there. We have CG4 and CJ4, low ash, for the newer engines that have to use the low sulfur diesel, ULSD fuel. Alright, this is a kind of a quick thing on the ILSAC ratings. You don't really have to know all of this, but you can see it on your chart. What's important is the new stuff. GF5 started in the summer of 2010 for use in all the new stuff, 2011 and up. You always should see a starburst on the front, and GF means a gasoline-fueled engine. So you're looking for that starburst on the front. If it doesn't have it, you don't have an ILSAC rating. High temp, low shear. This is actually kind of an engineer test thing. We don't really need to know this other than kind of being aware that they have to meet a kind of a minimum shear number. If they are higher than that, it may not be as fuel efficient. That's really the important thing here. MPG. Some people are crazy about it. Other customers aren't going to care. Buyer beware. Top end oils such as AMSOIL, Redline, and Royal Purple lack or may lack the proper certifications. Now, at the seminar, it was mentioned that some of these are now getting these certifications. Bottom line, look on the can, make sure it has the certification.
So it means if it's not on the bottle or the can,
you can't use it. It has to meet the spec.
even if the salesman tells me it's good.
Especially if the salesman tells you it's good. Because we've all heard that before. All right. High mileage and extended performance oils often do not meet certification and performance specs. All right. You got to watch that. All right. Bulk oils. Even low-cost bulk oils can meet the specs. You have to get the spec sheet from the company that sells it to you, though.
So that's like from a barrel or something?
That could be a barrel. That could be a drum, you know, whatever. It could be bulk loaded, pumped out of a truck into your big storage tank. The bottom line is you have to have paperwork that shows that that oil meets the spec that you're using it for. This one here, if you look at this tag here, it says 5W30 SAE, API up to SM, SLSM, energy conserving, LSAC GF4, Ford there's a Ford spec there, WSS, I mean M2C 929A, Daimler Chrysler in this case, and GM, this 6094 spec. So it meets all of those. But again, you don't see a VW or you don't see a Mercedes. You don't see those specs on here. Bmw, you don't see any of that on there. You'd have, speaking of BMW, they have long life spec, LL98, 01, and 04. What they don't show here is for their M motors, they also have a special spec for that. It's not on here. M motors need a special oil, 10W60 special oil. Again, read the specs for the particular car you're working on. All right. Special note here. Most European vehicles need to meet a manufacturer spec. It's their spec. It's not, you know, API or whatever. They have their own specification. And I'm going to get into case studies with that a little later. All right. Cars that need special oil. We're going to have a bunch of these. General Motors. All right. Here's the GM spec on the can, on the label. 4718M, 6094M. Bottom line is there are a variety of specs. You want to make sure it's for your vehicle, especially when you're getting into high performance, you know, a Corvette, whatever, you have to be very careful. European, Cadillac, Cetera, and so forth, they have their own specs, actually more closely aligned with European manufacturer specs, but they have their own oil specs. And the new stuff, Dexos 1 is GM's new specification for, that's supposed to be backwards compatible and global for all vehicles in the whole world that GM sells.
So basically that oil only meets a couple of those specs there, that Corvette and many GMs, but not that new stuff.
Right, that's correct. The Dexos 1 and oil manufacturers, oil producers are kind of resisting this, but eventually they're going to all come on board. The Dexos 2 is also the new global diesel GM oil, 2011 vehicles. GM's sticking to their guns on this, so everybody's going to have to jump on board or they're going to not be able to sell oil for GM. As you can see, by the way, this label also shows that even though it meets this GM spec, it also meets a Chrysler spec, a Ford spec, and a Honda Acura spec. All right, more cars that need special oil. Ford. As you can see, there's a few specs here. 5W20, a 5W30 for different engines, and a different 5W20 You have to make sure it meets the spec. Again, read the spec for that car, the one you're working on. Don't just say, I got Ford oil, it's good. All right, Chrysler. Now this one meets not only Chrysler, but it meets the Honda Acura oil. This is a Mobil 1 for Acura RDX Turbo only. By the way, on Mobil 1, I love Mobil 1. There's a lot of Mobil 1s. You have to be careful, it's not just the weight. It's the starburst, it's the spec. Long life, or, you know, high efficiency, you know, low resistance. You got to be careful of which oil you're buying. There's a lot of Mobil 1s out there. All right, Mercedes. We have a bunch of Mercedes specs. They've tried to make it so that every newer spec is backwards compatible. And they say that's true, but I'm not 100% convinced of that. All right, they have this super high performance diesel spec. They have the extended drain spec. As they went further along, they tried to put them together, and they have low ash spec. Long life, most Mercedes, they want that extended oil change interval in there. And low ash exceeds. So you see this one, 22951, it meets the spec above, it exceeds it. It has to have that on the can. Or there. I say cans, I'm not sure there are any cans anymore. They're all plastic things, but whatever. Porsche. Porsche is in a world of their own. They have this A3 040, 540, and 550 motor oils. Again, look for it. It's an ACEA A3 B4, and it's the Porsche spec as well. ACEA is a European.
So what may happen if I put the wrong oil in that Porsche? Some common causes of putting the wrong oil in today's car.
Common effects are some type of upper end damage is the most common thing. So cam distress, lifter load, you know, those kind of distress, Vanos or whatever variable cam timing system is in it, distress. Eventually the metal gets into the bottom end and starts chewing up, you know, if it punches through the oil filter, it gets into rod bearings. Usually it's top end distress.
And why is that?
Because the friction modifiers in the oil are not up to the task of whatever those momentary loads are on those high load devices, cam lobes especially. And Vanos, because there's sliding gears that can bind.
Does it have anything to do with sometimes the orifice and a thicker oil?
That's a different problem. That's more viscosity related than additive rating related. But too thick an oil will block passageways that are purposely made small for quick pump up times. And as a result, you can get starvation, especially at very cold temperatures on cold starts.
So like variable timing and stuff won't work then, is that correct?
It won't work, and it may suffer permanent damage. If the metal pieces are getting not lubricated during that cold start, you may end up with scoring that eventually escalates into a full-blown failure.
And it also set codes, correct?
It can set codes, and it may not always. That's the problem. If it set codes right away, maybe you'd stop earlier. A lot of times people put this stuff in, drive down the road for a while, and don't know they have damage till later.
So that's one clue you could say if
That is one clue, if it's setting codes. We had a case in this VW dealer I'm now in when I was there only a few weeks, where the car had 90,000 miles, and it had been going to a place that was using regular petroleum oil, did not meet the VW spec for 40,000 miles. They got away with it, they thought, for 40,000 miles. Car came in with an unusual symptom, which was losing an oil pressure light at revs, not at idle. And what was happening was so many chips of aluminum and other things were in the engine that it was plugging the screen, but it was acting like a sock. And so as the engine revved up, it was sucking the stuff up and blocking oil flow, and as the revs went down, it was getting lubrication, barely enough.
So you would say a good starting point of if you do have a code for variable valve timing, the first step is to check the oil.
Check oil pressure, make sure it's got the right oil in it, and if in doubt, drop the pin and look for debris in the pickup, because it may be too late at that point.
There's no easy way to check what the weight of oil is, right?
No, you just have to take it out and put the
right
right stuff in. See if the symptoms go.
I've actually had that.
But in my opinion, anytime you have something like this that you're worried about, you should be dropping the pan and physically examining the bottom to see what's in there.
So Volkswagen out here, it says you can't use a regular oil at all.
Cannot use a regular oil. It has to meet their specifications.
Then does that mean that they only use synthetic in those?
They only use synthetic in those. Those are all synthetic oils in VW now.
From what year?
That's a good question. It's a long time now. It's in the mid-90s on.
Okay.
Early 90s on, I think. Been a long time. Pretty much anything you're going to see. All right. Case study. Speaking of Volkswagen. 2003 VW Passat with a 1.8 turbo. It's been using the API approved oil instead of the VW approved, the 502 oil. If you look back at the previous chart, we had, oops, I hit too many buttons here. We're up to 505, but this particular oil only needed this particular vehicle only needed a 502, and it was developing serious sludge problems. This engine does have a habit of developing serious sludge problems. Symptoms include tapping, chain rattling, cam advance issues, misfire, and timing codes. That's when it's setting the codes. And some engines have seized.
So Pierre, what you're saying then, if it misfires from oil, we could even get a CAT code like a 420 or 430 out of this thing.
We could actually, yes. I haven't seen it, but we could get it, yes.
Well, I think you was telling a story one time that some of the Volkswagens are experiencing a lot of CAT codes.
We're getting a lot of CAT codes. I don't think we're getting so many from this. We're getting a lot from problems with misfire. They've had a lot of ignition coil issues. They've had a lot of oxy sensors that don't get changed till it's way too late. And they've had some issues with the actual CAT itself. All right. VW direct injection. These are a high pressure pump vehicle, and this is a poor picture, but it's a cam lobe that's been ground up. This bucket here used to be solid, and it ground all the way through. This was a cylindrical shape end on the high pressure pump. This is the bottom of the high pressure pump, and it's been destroyed. It's a very expensive job. You got to change the cam, you got to change the pump, you got to change the bucket, and you got to rip a lot of stuff apart.
All a result of?
All a result of having a non-VW spec, in this case non-synthetic oil in the vehicle.
So when some of our customers go to these quick places,
that's where this damage actually happened.
What is
yes.
1995 cheapy oil changes?
Bad news. If it was a quick place that used the right oil, nothing wrong with that. And the right filter. But if they use the wrong oil and the wrong filter, you're taking your chances with it.
So it's a must educate your customers on that.
The customer must be educated. They can't just trust. This case here was a quick oil change place that did this. And in fact, there's a lawsuit on it right now. They're going to end up buying the motor. Because there was so much metal in this motor, it was everywhere. There was a lot of damage in this motor. It wasn't just the cam that got done. All right, high mileage oil. Usually higher viscosity and therefore cannot meet the GF4 rating. It's not going to be as fuel efficient, but it's high mileage. Long oil changes, 15,000 mile oil changes, things like that, are what they're rated for. It's not. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't agree with it. They have esters in them. They swell seals. You can end up with permanent damage. Eventually, those swollen seals will split, and you'll end up with all kinds of mayhem. All right. Supposedly used in engines with higher, supposed to be used in engines with higher mileage, 75,000 or more. Doesn't meet the specs, and I don't agree with using them. If you've been using the right oil, you don't need this stuff.
Is there a starburst listed on the can?
And yes, note, no starburst.
And is that a Mobile One, it looks like, right?
That's a Mobile One. It's a Mobile One. They have a lot of products, Mobile One. They have, I don't know, 15, 16 different oils. And maybe more than that. I'm not really counting, but they have a lot of different oils that may seem the same. Show Rotella, best for diesels. This is great stuff. I use it in my backhoe. You got to use Shell Rotella diesel. It does still have enough ZDDP, a chemical name I still can't pronounce, but it's a zinc conglomerate molecule that's used as a kind of a slipperiness enhancer. It protects the engine against very high loads like you find in diesels. All right. Again, make sure it meets the specs. Look at that, ACEA E7, Caterpillar. This is obviously for heavy equipment, but notice, Volvo. We didn't mention Volvo before, but they have their own specs. Mercedes has their own specs. You got to make sure it meets your spec for whatever you're working on. Get those specs. All right. GM oil life monitor, right in the scan tool. You can read it. Oil life, 96%. I don't always trust these things, but it's a good. It's kind of a helpful indicator.
Now, some of these cars I've been seeing, you can't even tell how much oil's in it without looking at a scan tool. Just like the trannies.
Yeah, that's correct. Though most of them have some kind of indicator on the dashboard. The indicator says low, medium, or full. Not really a good. And by the way, those sensors can fail. So that's a problem, and they're all going to it eventually because they don't want to have these systems in the car that.
Is the reason for customers so they can't put the wrong oil in their motors?
You know, I'm not sure I can speak to what the engineers are thinking. I think it's a cost thing more than anything else, and little by little they're trying to force people back to the dealers.
Well,
And the less observable a vehicle is, the less testable a vehicle is outside of the dealer network, the more likely people are going to go to the dealer.
well, I heard, Eric, that they didn't want to put the tranny sticks in or give you any accessibility to put transmission fluid in because they didn't want the wrong
They don't want you
fluid in.
contaminating.
That's
One of the
contaminating.
lines with transmissions, we're not really talking transmissions or other boxes here, but one of the issues that they've said is that actually a lot of failures occur because it was serviced and something was done wrong. Dirt was introduced, the wrong fluid was put in, not enough fluid was put in, whatever. They ran it kind of dry before it got filled up. That they found over the fleet, over the life of the vehicle, that it was better to just have what they call lifetime fluid or non-serviceable boxes. In reality, they're controlling the lifetime of the vehicle. Okay, oil-related faults, gelling and sludging. Usually caused by extended intervals. One of the many reasons I don't like to do this. Can be caused by coolant or other contaminants in the oil. Engine design or cooling system faults. Obviously, if it's overheating, you're going to have a much bigger tendency. If you have PCV problems, you're going to have a much bigger tendency to have gelling and sludging. Now, that all of this said, whatever the recommendations are here, whatever they say for extended intervals, I generally disagree with extended intervals. However, all the manufacturers make a deal with the EPA. They have to reduce their petroleum footprint, and because of that, they're going for extended intervals. It makes them look good to Consumer Reports. It makes them look good to EPA. And it hurts you as a consumer, and as a shop owner, you should be, or a tech, you should be trying to sell what makes it last. All right, my favorite cars, BMW, oil-related faults.
Is that your car, Pierre?
No, that was not my personal vehicle, though yeah, this was a vehicle I had just assembled. I had done a head job after an overheat. It had nothing to do with lubrication. It had to do with stupidity. All right. No oil problems. Now what I want to point out though is you can only see the ends of them. These gears are helical gears. One goes one way, one goes the other way. And the Vanos basically pulls a pulse width modulated actuator in and out, and in the process changes the relationship of this gear to the camshaft. That's how it affects the advance. Those gears have a lot of pressure on them. Lubrication failures there are what cause the damage. That's exactly where the damage happens. It happens in here and on the bore of the piston, which isn't in this picture. I'm not sure I actually have a picture of that. The bore of the piston gets scored. Here's a better picture of this is a high mileage engine that used BMW synthetic oil through its life. It had about 200,000 miles on it at the time. And you can see the gears, and there was nothing wrong with these gears. This cover was not off for that purpose. It was off because the O-rings in the Vanos had actually broken or were leaking anyway. But this shows what it would look like. Everything was good in this engine. There's no damage on these gears. This is what you're looking for. You're looking for these surfaces to be smooth. That's the good one. There's the bad one. This is sludge. This is extended oil changes on steroids. This was a vehicle that had 15,000 mile interval, but the light would come on and they'd get around to changing the oil a month or two later. Very bad. And once this exists in the motor, it's really, you can get all these flushing products, but it's really a chance thing whether there's permanent damage or
On these
not.
particular BMWs, does it chatter when it starts failing?
there's actually a lot of different generations of Vanos. This particular Vanos, which would have been a kind of a mid-90s, late 90s version, would usually not actually chatter. What it would have, however, would be codes for cam advance. It might have a power problem. It might have a. Sometimes they had a misfire problem if they hung in the other direction, in the advanced direction. Earlier generations than this had they had a different layout inside the Vanos. It would chatter and it would actually cause the timing retard. The knock sensor would hear it and pull back timing back till the car ran like a total pig.
That's similar to the Porsche setup as well.
Right. Yeah, they all went to the same university.
Yeah.
Okay. S54, that's the S engines in BMW were sport motors as opposed to M or N engines, which are regular motors. S motors operate under much higher pressure. They're very high powered. This particular engine is a 333 horsepower engine in a 6-cylinder, not little, but it's a 3.2 liter 6-cylinder engine, putting out a lot of horses and a lot of torque. And it operates at like 1,400 pounds of pressure in the Vanos. The thing to understand here is, again, it's got special oil, 10W60. It can start, you can get some engine rattling, you can get noises in this particular one. And it can escalate to complete engine failure, especially considering how these cars are driven. Really it's recommended you have to use the right oil. You also have to be careful about when you draw the line on the Vanos. Vanos does not have serviceable parts. You have to change the whole thing. It's very expensive. It's over $2 grand.
What about additives you would buy at a store, like Lucas
You know, I've liked some additives over the years. As a rule, don't.
So pretty much would you void warranty by using additives?
And virtually all additives will void the warranty. You only even try them out of warranty, and you let the customer know that they're a test pilot. I just used that line with a customer yesterday. They wanted to be a test pilot. Okay. Here's the thing. It won't set a code until it's done quite a bit of adaptation. So you need a scan tool. You need a factory level, a high level scan tool to be able to actually read this stuff. And only complete assemblies are available. You can't get a rebuild kit from anybody on this particular one. There's a blow up of it, a lot of parts. But other than the bolts that hold it on, you can't get the pieces. And by the way, they run an accumulator on this that's a separate piece that has had issues. Another reason not to use the wrong oil or to forget changing it. All right, do the following. Check the oil level before you change it. Know where you're at, how much it's using. Document it. Check that the oil you're using meets the manufacturer's spec. Read the can. Recommend.
Is there a place if you have a problem, you could have your oil tested?
There are test facilities. They generally send you empty containers and a return envelope, and you take a sample of the oil. Now, my recommendation on that is warm it up, let some drain, get it from the middle of the stream, and then send it off, and they'll give you a result. However, with testing oils, one test is not generally all that. If you're really concerned about the life of your engine, unless it's a catastrophic failure, generally you have to test a sequence to get an idea of pattern, a wear pattern.
The city down where I work, they have a special machine, thousands of dollars, that actually you can take a sample off the dipstick, tell you the viscosity, what type of wear there is in the engine, but a very expensive machine.
No, but I don't know anybody in the repair industry that has
That's
those.
good. So you got to send it out.
You got to send it to a lab.
But
They basically do a mass spectrometer test and look for different metals, different chemicals. They'll test viscosity and they'll test all of that stuff.
and they'll reset that oil monitor light.
And reset the light so the customer knows to come in. And I like to put a sticker on the windshield. I'm old-fashioned that way. I don't put them on the door jamb because nobody looks at those.
And I know when I see a car come in where someone had their oil changed elsewhere, new sticker on it, but the oil light monitor has not been reset. It looks so unprofessional, whoever did that oil change.
And you may check the oil and it looks black, and that's what you have to inform the customer. The oil looks dirty.
You know, we also found when the oil is black sometimes, they used the wrong oil.
Right.
Putting the right oil in, now it doesn't get black right away.
Right, yeah. All of those specs, we're not going to get into all of those specs today because that's really more engineering stuff, but the fact of the matter is, that's why they're all the specs. There's a lot of specs on how well it handles heat, viscosity, shear, additives for anti-corrosion, or how, it's just not how slippery it is, but it's a spec for how slippery it is. It's not the name of it. And all kinds of other specs that are kind of more esoteric as far as compatibility with materials.
Can the wrong oil damage catalytic converters?
The wrong oil absolutely can damage catalytic converters. And if you start getting into PZEV cars, I think Mark Warren did a big thing on this at a previous seminar with us. You can really ruin the catalytic converter. The oil vapors have various compounds. I think sulfur and phosphorus were the biggies, but probably other things as well. They end up going through the PCV system, burning in the engine, and coating or damaging the catalytic converter. All right, quick quiz. Which oil here should not be put in your vehicle? And the hint, of course, is look at the label. Starburst, no starburst, starburst. There's the one. It's an extended performance. It's a 530. They're all 530s. But that's the one that doesn't meet the spec.
And it's Mobile One. Wow.
And they're all Mobile One. All Mobile One. You know, it says NASCAR on it. It's got to be good, right? I think I'll put that in my Chevy. All right. Quick quiz again. Which oil can you switch to if your vehicle has 75,000 miles without causing problems? Again, you're going to look for what's on the label. This one here. All right? They don't meet the manufacturer's specs. You got to look for the manufacturer's, not just on the front. You have to look at the back. Make sure it meets your spec. All right?
So that Valvoline Max Life there looks like a good oil, but has no starburst.
Has no starburst. Starburst. No star. There's a starburst. No starburst there, and you don't know what specs it meets.
Is it true that you cannot change from synthetic to regular, or vice versa?
That's actually a bit of a fallacy, but there are some risks involved. It used to be that if you switched from regular, on a high mileage oil, from regular petroleum oil to synthetic, that there was some conditioning of seals that was going on and they would leak like sieves. I don't think that's true anymore. But you do have to watch going back and forth. Again, read the specs. I would recommend not doing that. You'd probably have to flush it out with a...
I did that on my Jeep. I always changed the oil every 3,000 miles, and I used regular oil in the beginning, switched over probably the last 10,000, 20,000 miles to synthetic, and no problem it leaks. But the older cars,
they had problems with
customers wanted to
seals.
switch, they had seal problems.
They had seal issues. I don't think that's true anymore, but only because the chemistry of things like seals has gotten more
I do
stable.
get asked that question often. That's why.
You do, yeah. As a rule, I don't recommend switching back and forth. It's not a good idea. They say all the oils are compatible. You could put a quart of petroleum oil in with synthetic. I don't like that. All right. This oil lacks an API label on the back. Is it still good? Again, if you need if you got to meet that spec. It meets all these ACEA specs, A3B4 and so forth on down. API, it has an API CF spec. All right, it's a compression ignition spec, but it's not. Actually, it says SM on it, API. There's actually something in that slide that's a little screwy. The bottom line is if it doesn't have an API spec on it and you need an API spec on your oil, no, the answer is no. Going back actually. Peugeot, Citroën, these are things we don't really see here because these cars aren't really imported here. VW, 502, 503, 505, and so forth.
So it met the spec, but only on VW, Mercedes, and
That's
BMW.
correct, but you wouldn't want to put it in your Corvette.
Ah, look at that.
All right. Quick quiz. Is Auto Extra, CarQuest, Napa motor oil the exact same as regular and synthetic Valvoline? Again, look at the spec. You can actually contact the manufacturer and find out exactly what the compatibilities are. In this case, no. The answer is no. There are no manufacturer specs on the back of that can.
Yeah, I remember Craig wrote an article in TST newsletter, him and Kevin, and they were told by CarQuest and Napa that it was the exact same oil, but they did get an answer back from the vice president of Ashland Motor Oil Company, which is Valvoline,
Yeah,
and it's
they
not.
said, and it's not. So again, we talked about salesmen before. They'll sell you anything. Don't you want it in writing and not
Right.
just something you wrote on a pad.
And TST does have that letter in writing that it's not.
Yeah, we have that. Okay. This is a case study. 2002 Honda came into the training center here, or into the shop and back. It had violent engine bucking, and as you can see, it had a P1259. Indicated a general VTEC. VTEC is their cam timing, cam advancing system. Their variable valve timing. And common causes for this, as it says here, lower dirty oil, a plug screen, defective valve VTEC solenoid, or a bad malfunctioning pressure switch. The reason for the pressure switch being in there is it's reporting the wrong value, causing it to set itself wrong. All right, this is an all data pinout and description of the system from all data.
So it only
Right.
did that when it was warm.
It only did it after it warmed up. All right, this is the Bernie eScan tool. It shows the P1259. It shows the conditions under which it happened. So you're looking at load, 67%. It was 190 degrees. Short-term fuel trim. There's no fuel-related issues here. 3.9% short-term, virtually 0% long-term. MAP was 20, pretty much even. RPM was 2,300. This car was being driven, and it was under load when this happened. And it was calling for cam advance, and it wasn't responding properly.
So maybe if you tested that when it was cold, you would never see that.
And if it was cold, you probably wouldn't see any problem. All right. Only bucked when it was warm, and when the oil was a little thinner. All right. Indicated a general malfunction. Of course, you could change half the components in the system erroneously for this. Common causes, again, are listed here, and the shop decided to test the VTEC solenoid using pressure transducers, and they applied power to the solenoid, and it adjusted timing correctly. They also measured pressure. It was 48 pounds of pressure at the location, which was good. They're discounting basically a plug screen, a restriction. All right, here are the specs. There's a TSB on this for this symptom, and the important thing to see here is that they want 5W20 oil. Here's the pressure transducer arrangement they used. They took an old oil pressure switch. They didn't have an adapter. Took it. There's a good thing to do in the shop is make tools. They took an oil pressure sender, drilled it out, threaded it, and screwed the pressure transducer into it, and now they could measure oil pressure on a scope. All right. Now this is a kind of a schematic of where it is in the car. All data, again, courtesy of All Data. You got to have good information in your shop. This is a description of how the system works. We don't have to really go through it, but if you were following this procedure, you would look at that and make sure you understood system parameters and how it functions.
So this is very similar to the way this looks to a Vano system.
Very similar to Vano. It's very similar. Well, it's different from Volkswagen, but it's very similar to what a lot of the Europeans are doing. They're using some type of arrangement, usually helical gears, some type of arrangement to change cam timing. VW does it a little different. They actually do something that changes they stretch the chain, they move the chain between the two cams. Kind of a weird thing. All right.
And fun to work on.
And fun to work on, yeah. Okay. This is, so what they did, by the way, is they found that the oil was too thick. They changed the oil with the correct oil, and when they were done, they had the correct oil pressure measured with a transducer here. And the problem was gone. Remember, use your senses. Use your eyes, your nose, your ears, and so forth. Those are your kind of basic tools, the ones you always have with you. All right? A crushed oil filter, somebody's been hacking on the car. You know, you gotta expect trouble with the lubrication. All right? They called the customer, and his son-in-law had changed the oil and put in, you know, maybe it was whatever he had on the shelf. You know, it's all good. It's oil, right? All right.
So the difference, you mean just that 1030 to the 520 can cause that?
Absolutely. And it can cause bigger problems because in a cold start situation, it might starve for oil. You know, if it's 10 below zero, we had some very cold days this winter.
So maybe
10 below zero, you might actually do engine down.
So maybe
It might be, if it had happened in the summer, maybe it was hot enough where the oil thinned out and you wouldn't notice it. Or maybe you would. But
In all data, they give you that information, what times of year and what temperatures you
they
can
do.
use.
That's right. Yeah, in all that.
But
And,
most-
and the manufacturer's manuals also do it. Manufacturer's tech info.
a lot of those
also has-
Hondas want that 520 or, 020 on their hybrids and stuff like that.
That's right.
And they do-
Moral, don't forget the basics. Something as simple as the viscosity of the oil, looking at things that are bent or, up here, this oil filter looks like it's been hacked pretty bad. You want to make sure that you cover that. All right. We're going to cut here?
Yeah. Okay. Stop a second.
Very good job, that was
My
good.
back's a little sore.
You're doing good.
Yeah,
Better than I did in
Craig,
front
this
of the
is
crowd,
the
huh?
cut at the coolant. Oh, very good.
Yeah.
You were just nervous. And you're pretty
Well,
much on track.
And I was really screwed up when the slides started advancing themselves.
See, I had no clue. I figured you were using the exact thing I did for you.
I don't know PowerPoint, I just
yeah.
I put
You almost had to
obviously
build one yourself
I
that
put
you
it
got
in
share.
I put it in that what was it, practice mode? What's it called?
Yeah, practice mode.
Practice mode? And I didn't realize that. I thought as soon as I shut the file off it would be out of that.
No, locks in. I didn't look.
Well, how would you know that I did
All
that?
right, Mr. Eric.
So anyway,
Yeah, you can see.
we're ahead of it, but we're not going to get through it before 4:30. So we're
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
see
you
you guys.
for
Thank
being
you.
the question asker. To help.
Yeah.
You know what I didn't say in the
I
beginning
don't
is
want
that
to
you
waste
guys.
time
would-
either. I'm like, these are questions as a tech that I'd be asking out in the field.
That's
you know what I
right.
mean?
Yeah. And we don't always get answers to.
Well, then get them for
You
yourself.
talk to the salesman. I mean,
You should also mention
I've
something
met-
about here at TSC. We do a lot of networking to get more information.
actually that's a good idea.
I was going to say that earlier. That,
Yeah.
where else
I'll
would you
say
find
that.
that information?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know what
I'll
I
say that because that is actually a strength. Something we've had.
Well, that's it.
We
That's
haven't really sold it well, but
You'd be watching this
Networking.
because you were part of TST. We need to spread the word out. to
networking's
more,
good.
Well, I tell you, it looked like we had a lot of guys that were very, very impressed that you would come into all the seminars. I heard good things from everyone that showed up.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Even some people that knew Pierre and said, okay, he didn't do good that day, but hey, it was still good. Things happen and they understand it.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
were mostly good.
if you were
we
some-
got some crappy reviews, and I guess I earned some crappy.
If you were some bozo, then they would have had an issue with the whole thing. But they realize, hey, you're not a professional presenter. Shit happens.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. But you're doing
That's right.
very good now. So, all right, Mr. Eric, we'll let you go.
Another thing, I do want to talk to you about that other issue I was talking about, getting more money for TST through that Howard program. I want you to
Oh
look at
yes,
as well.
yes. So you're gonna bring that up at one of the meetings.
Yeah, I'll get some information handed
I'm
to
gonna
you.
look at my schedule. I gotta make Crippen before I'm out of here today. I gotta make Crippen's airfare.
Write this down. NAP Howard. And they
I'm
show
gonna
you
use the job while we're taking a break.
the 505, nonprofit organization, how to get extra money.
Okay,
All right.
very good.
Yeah, it'd be a pretty good thing. And I got a fleet of people behind it too now. So.
Beautiful. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Say hello to the wife and the kiddies.
When I'm home.
Yeah, when you're home. I know the feeling.
All right, man. Good seeing you.
All right, same. Thanks again, Eric.
All right, buddy.
Okay, Craig, so you probably got about 5 minutes, Craig, here to cut out. And what we'll do is I'll make Pierre say, okay, now we're on coolants a couple of times here, so you can kind of jerk and adjust it. I don't want to stop it and mess crap up.
By the way, what I forgot to mention in my original announcement was that we had technical difficulties. I didn't
We'll say it at the end. Say it at the end, it's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Now, just say we're here at coolants, whatever. Now we're on coolants, and just move more into the picture. Okay, on
Like
the count of 5.
I can actually leave a little space, right? 'Cause
Yeah, you're good. You're good.
It had a little problems with recording it.
Right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, welcome to the TST seminar. What you don't know about fluids, this is the coolant section. We're going to go over the chemistries involved and what you need to know to put the correct coolant in vehicles that you service. All right, what is coolant? We all think we know this. Basically, it's generally a mixture of between 50-50 and 60-40 ethylene glycol and water. There are some propylene glycols, we're going to get into that, but for us it's ethylene glycol and water. There are other additives, lubricants, water pump lubricants, rust inhibitors, and other additives that we're going to go into. All right, freeze and boil. There's a chart here. We don't have to go over this. You can read it on a can. The bottom line is water is a great coolant, but it freezes at 32 degrees, it boils at 212 at atmospheric pressure, and it also is a wonderful corrosion promoter. Ethylene glycol, green stuff. Ethylene glycol, by the way, is colorless. Green stuff, they just they add dyes to them. That's the base. It's used in every factory fill. The additive package varies, and actually that's what this is all about, how it varies and why it's important to you. You can see on this can here, GM, Ford, Chrysler. Nothing here about European, Japanese, or whatever. This was the other type, propylene glycol. This stuff's used a lot in RVs for their plumbing systems or storing them for winter. That cabin in the woods to make it so the pipes don't freeze. It's a lot less toxic. They tell you it's not toxic, but it's a lot less toxic. Unfortunately, it does not handle the extreme heats of automotive engines, and it's really not a good idea. It's not recommended by any manufacturer, as you can see here. It's more expensive as well. There's really no good reason to put it in a car. You're just a test pilot. You're
So even though it's AMSOIL,
AMSOIL, an aftermarket brand of a lot of chemicals and oils, not a good idea. This is a case where you don't believe the salesman. I have it in my wood-burning boiler at home, but it's not for a car. All right, water. We all think we know about water, but here's the bottom line. It has stuff dissolved in it. Water is known as the universal solvent, if you remember your high school chemistry. Excellent thermal conductivity, good specific heat, holds a lot of heat in it per quart gallon or whatever. But as I said before, here's the bad stuff. Freezes at 32, boils at 212, and it also has the problem of corrosion and not being a good water pump lubricant. All right, it has to be clean. The slide says, use deionized, distilled, demineralized, or purified. For me, I like distilled. In my mind, there's nothing cleaner than distilled. A lot of manufacturers will tell you that you need deionized. The bottom line is it has to be clean. If in doubt, if you have stains on your sink at your shop, and they look like iron or anything else, you probably have an issue with your water.
Is this why some of the manufacturers are doing premix stuff nowadays?
That's part of why they're using premix. It's a big part of it because there's all kinds of additives that get put into water. It's not just the water as it left the reservoir or the well. There's water treatment. You know, you have chlorides, you have things that are put in to kill bacteria or to put the pH where they want it, but they might make a mistake, and it may not be compatible with antifreezes. Different manufacturers, this pH, something we don't really talk about much, but different manufacturers want different pHs in their coolants. This stuff here is just a bunch of crud. All right, what to do? If in doubt, test the water at the shop. If it has a high mineral content, consider using distilled, demineralized, or getting a treatment. You got to watch the treatment processes, though. Again, the salesman there might sell you the wrong thing. Reverse osmosis would be the best. that really does clean it out. I don't know about microfiltration. I'm not so sure about that. Okay, additives. As I already said before, I didn't mention pH, but they reduce corrosion. It's not listed here, but there are water pump lubricants in there. They adjust the pH because they have specific requirements, and they add a color so that they can, so that you can identify their coolant, and also so you can see when it leaks. It'll give you an indication of where it's leaking. It usually ends up as some type of a stain or a powdery residue.
So Pierre, you can use like a black light type thing, like an air condition?
Most, yes, absolutely. It's not like it's not exactly the same frequencies as air conditioning necessarily, but most manufacturers of antifreeze or coolants today put some type of UV dye in the coolant so you can see it. You got to watch that your glasses are matched to your light. There are different frequencies of black lights, but it is possible to do it. As you can see, there's a chart here. I'm not going to go over it, but they have different colors. Some of the colors overlap. You have a GM green and a Chrysler green and a Ford green. Read the specs. All right? The text here says it all. It helps us identify it, but that doesn't mean that it's the total answer. You got to read the specs. If in doubt, I'm going to say this a few times. If in doubt, and you don't know what's in the car, flush it out, flush it very well, make sure it's got clear water in it, and then put in the correct coolant. You don't want to mix. Mixing is a very bad thing, or can be. All right. Inorganic additive technology. This is the old antifreeze we knew from the time I was a little kid until they started to get tricky with it. I guess that was probably in the mid-'80s. I'm not really sure of the year, but it sounds about right. That's when I became aware of it. About the mid-'80s, we started to have, actually early '80s, started to have problems, and manufacturers were coming up with solutions. They were coming up with their own coolants. And I was doing BMW exclusively at that point. We had unusual failures in BMW. After a few years of those, where we had radiators that looked flawless, no broken fins, no plugged anything, and yet the coolant leaving the radiator was virtually the same temperature as the coolant getting into the radiator. There was no heat exchange going on. They came up with their own coolant. I started using their coolant with distilled water, and the radiators lasted virtually forever until they started raising pressures and temperatures and the plastic housings blew apart. All right, this is the traditional stuff. You have to change it regularly, and it's become pretty much obsolete, actually. All right, it's usually green. That's the green coolant we're used to. It can contain silicates, which is one of the reasons they've gotten rid of this stuff. They're abrasive dropouts. They cause all kinds of trouble. Phosphates and borates. Not only do they offer problems in the cooling system, but they're oftentimes incompatible with modern, catalytic converters, modern pollution control equipment, let's call it. All right, it's considered obsolete. I don't know, it probably exists somewhere. Don't buy it.
Well, it's the stuff the guy comes around and tries to sell you cheap.
Yeah, he sells it to you cheap, right. And it's going to cost you a lot of money. I've seen some unbelievable problems from wrong coolants, by the way. All right. Organic acid technology. That's what's found in Dexcool. Dexcool's just one brand. And you can see there's all these different places, parts of the world where OAT technology is being used. It's, I guess, probably the predominant type of coolant now until we get into hybrids and so forth. GM, VW, Japanese Americans, a lot of vehicles are using OAT technology. It's good for long life. I don't know that I would totally follow the spec on how long the life is. I'm still a big believer in flushing coolant every 2 or 3 years and making sure you use distilled water. Downside, it's not compatible with other types. That's why I said flush it. I'll say it again. If you don't know what's in the system, drain it all out, flush it all out with water, make sure it's clean, and then put in the right stuff. Otherwise, you can end up with things precipitating out of it. You can get the jello effect, the goo effect, different electrolysis effect, or pH issues where you have massive corrosion problems. I saw an engine once that looked like it had wormholes through the head. Massive coolant incompatibility, and some other shop had put that head on a 1.5 years earlier. It was a brand new cylinder head on a BMW with holes in it. Very nasty. Okay, OAT continued. You don't really have to know this, what these chemical names, nitrates, amines, phosphates, and silicate free. The bottom line is, that's why I'm saying you have to flush it if you don't know what it is. Again, read the spec on it. The back of that can is going to tell you what the spec is on it. Make sure it is for your application. Alright? DexCool is only one brand. If you see a color in there and it's what you're supposed to have and you kind of know the history on the car, you can add makeup coolant. If you don't, sell a flush or don't touch it. Don't get stuck in a situation where you put a thermostat in that car, drain some coolant out, put the right stuff in, it's now incompatible, and the engine ends up with jello and an overheat and needs a motor. Tell the customer you cannot do that job unless you flush it. Otherwise, you know, you're the one holding the bag. Okay. DexCool concerns that are kind of unique to OAT technology. Root cause seems to be air entering the system. You get aeration. You end up with a little chemistry change, and you end up with the brown gunk. This is not the jello effect. This is that mud effect. I'm not sure mud's a chemical term, but it looks like mud. And it blocks things up, causes local hotspots, overheating, and it's a real bear to get it out.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot on GM cars.
Yeah. We've seen it at Volkswagen to some degree. Compatibility issue. Rust in the engine, we've all seen this. We don't need to harp on it. Bottom line is, if you see rust in the engine, you know you've got a problem with your coolant. You got to flush very aggressively and then put the right stuff in.
And probably check those freeze-out plugs.
And oh yeah, and look for subsequent damage, not just freeze-out plugs. Plastic impellers on water pumps, maybe an overstressed thermostat, freeze-out plugs, damage to a heater core, any of that stuff.
Just like you have up there too.
There you go. There's a rotted gasket, you know, so forth. There's a class action suit. GM may have to pay for intake gaskets and so forth. But this is only the tip of the iceberg here. Bottom line, if one comes your way, you have to protect yourself and tell the customer you have to do the whole job, or I don't mean to sound like my way or the highway, but it's my way or the highway. Okay, DexCool's unique formulation. I have trouble pronouncing this word, but it's an ethyl hexanoic acid. All right, that's what it's using as a corrosion inhibitor.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful, and it's not compatible with other corrosion inhibitors. All right, it can damage plastics. So this is where you got to watch out. What if you're using an aftermarket part that you just put in the car? It's not a compatible chemistry to the correct coolant, and now you end up with a problem down the road because you bought that part that was not to spec. You got to watch that stuff. It's not just the coolant; it's the whole picture.
Especially the stuff made in China, man.
Yeah, we all have stories about stuff that was made in, you know, to very bad specifications, if there were any specifications. They make them so they look alike. All right. G30, OAT, and Peak Global do not meet 2EH. You got to watch that. You're going to have a salesman who tells you this stuff is good. Read the specs. Read the back of the can. Make sure it meets the spec for your vehicle that you're working on right now.
So even though they have some race car driver on that Peak bottle,
they have a great ad. They got somebody you like on the racetrack advertising. Don't buy that. Buy what the spec is on the bottle, on the can. All right. Hybrids, HOATs. This is the next generation. They call it hybrid. Hybrid's a very popular word right now. Everything's a hybrid.
not necessarily to be used in a hybrid vehicle.
No. This is, that's the bottom line. They're using the word hybrid because it's popular. It's a popular word. You got to be hybrid or you're not up with the times. It's a marketing thing. The bottom line is it's found in a lot of newer vehicles. You see here, Ford, Chrysler, Mercedes. It's supposed to combine the best aspects of IAT and OAT, and I'm sure it does. They want to give you this lifetime don't ever change it thing. Again, I disagree with that. Change the coolant. Put the customer on a schedule. What I've always liked to do is say, look, this is what the manufacturer says, and this is what I say. That way they're not thinking that you don't know what you're talking about. Quite the contrary. They're thinking, this person has a professional opinion that may be better, more beneficial to me, the customer, than what the manufacturer of the car is saying.
Well, let's face it, when a manufacturer gives you some 15,000 mile oil change and some 5-year, $100,000 antifreeze, that's under ideal conditions without any extreme weather conditions being too hot or too cold.
And they're trying to reduce their cost of maintaining that vehicle under a cost-free maintenance program that the manufacturer offers you.
Isn't that just like the battery that's guaranteed for life and exhaust?
And it's all an insurance game, basically. Basically, they have an internal insurance policy. They know it's costing them X number of dollars per vehicle to have that policy. And if 1 or 2 blow up, it's not their problem. The problem for the customer is if they get out of that range and they're not dealing with the dealer, they have to pay these massive repairs, and they're not going to go past 100,000 miles or whatever. So if they want it to last a long time, and you want them to come back to your shop, you have to be more aggressive than that. You have to sell it for the long haul. All right. HOAT can be different colors. We currently have a red stuff, blue, VW, blue stuff at BMW. And again, just make sure you're not mixing anything. If in doubt, I'll say it again, I'm going to say it a number of times. If you don't know what's in there, even if it's the right color, tell the customer you have to flush it, you have to put the right thing in. And it's not because you're sure that they have the wrong thing in. You don't want to badmouth the other guy. It's because you don't know. And if you don't know, you have to explain that there could be chemistry issues that can cause massive engine damage, including failure. Customers don't like to hear about engine failure.
Well, like that yellow, sometimes you see that in the Fords. But if it's not the right stuff, even if it's in a electric hybrid vehicle,
that's right,
and it's not correct, you may be doing some serious damage.
Yeah, you don't want to be buying those engines.
And how about the guys that put additive color in when they're reusing the antifreeze by cleaning it up and recycling?
That's the other issue, and that's part of why I say if you don't know what's in there, I'm going to say it again. If you don't know what's in there, you have to flush it out and make sure the right stuff is in there, because there are shops who are selling remanufactured coolant. They have a machine that cleans it out, strips all the dye out, supposedly neutralizes, sets it to the right pH, puts an additive package back in, and then puts a dye in. Do you really know that that's right? I personally don't trust that technology, because even if it's perfect when the machine is new, you know how it is with a shop. Things get busy day to day. Oh, we don't need to add that stuff, whatever. They keep blasting it through and selling it. Now the car comes to your bay, it needs some kind of work. And if you add coolant to that coolant, you can end up with a big mess. And you're the guy buying the motor.
And let's also say this. Some of the motors nowadays are very expensive, whether it be a Mazda or Mercedes, a Beamer, a GM, whatever. These are not your father's Oldsmobile motors, are they?
No, that's correct. They're very costly.
Very costly.
And you can't rebuild most of them in the field. Many of them cannot be rebuilt in the field.
Correct.
I was just told something about that with Volkswagen. They're plasma coating the cylinders.
Wow.
That means you can't hone the cylinders. You can't do anything to the cylinders outside of a factory environment. Okay. That's just the way it is. All right. G designations. Again, read the specs. We don't have to really memorize this stuff. Glysantin, that's a trade name. G30, G34, G05. All right. Different from Texaco's Dexcool. G05 contains... You don't need to know this stuff. What you need to know is if it meets the spec for yours, and if you're unsure of what's in the car, you need to flush it out and put in something that meets that spec, but don't mix it with something else, because you don't know what the reaction's going to be. More G designations. Again, there's a blue stuff that VW used a long time ago. Then they had pink. Then they have this, I call it red, but they call it purple. Okay, whatever. It's red. It looks red in the car when you mix water with it, okay? It's an HOAT. It's a hybrid. It's phosphate free. They have their own chemistry. A lot of times these manufacturers are using chemistry in their cylinder heads or their water pumps or their hoses or radiators. That's part of why you have to be careful here.
I think what you gave us in the handout, Pierre, there was a couple of charts there from Napa, and I seen them also like in Motor Age.
Yes, that's right.
That chart that kind of tells you what's going on here, so we can use that handout, right?
And you can use the handout. And they talk about, we don't get into this too much here, but they talk about pH being very important, different With 0 pH is neutral water. Different technologies want different pHs, different acidity or basicness. They have to be a little more acid or a little more base. And you start playing with this stuff, that's where you end up in big trouble. Okay. Again, this stuff's in your handout. G48, low silicate and phosphate free. It's blue in color. Nitrite, again, these chemistry, you don't have to know the chemistries. What you have to know is the spec. BMW has their own spec. I've had very good luck with it over the years with distilled water. All right, replacement antifreeze. What I've been saying. Use the manufacturer's spec. There's the thing on pH. You don't have to memorize it. You could have this there, in your shop to look at. But in reality, all you have to know is that different pHs react with each other, different chemistries react with each other. All right. And a fresh antifreeze should have a pH between 9 and 11. This spec has changed over the years. Again, there are test strips. You can test this stuff. As a rule, as soon as it's anywhere away from the original spec, in my opinion, I get rid of it. I don't wait until the thing fails gigantically. That's just trouble waiting to happen.
Again, I guess that's a good recommendation because, as we just mentioned earlier, the cost of an engine and the cost of the cooling components, it's not worth fooling around.
Far outstrips it. And you know what the customer's going to say? The customer's going to say, you broke it.
Right.
Even though they drove that 130,000 miles before something happened, and they were the ones who told you they didn't want to flush the coolant because it was just done 3 years ago.
So I guess really here in kind of just wrapping that little thing, try to use the OE or good equivalent part. Try to use the correct antifreeze or coolant, however you want to say it, with meeting the spec, and use the strips to see if they're good.
That's right. Test it. There are also machines to test pH and so forth, not just strips for that, but the strips are there for the chemistry.
And
use those.
Check your water, I guess.
And check your water to make sure it's good water. And if in doubt, I'm saying it again, if you don't know what's in the system, flush it, make sure it's clear water all the way through, clean, 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 and then fill it with the right stuff. Make sure it meets your manufacturer's spec. Here are the different pHs. We don't have to memorize this stuff. We really don't. All right. Again, desired pH. We don't have to know a lot of this stuff. It's in your handout if you want to read it. The bottom line is there are additives that are used for different purposes in coolant, lowering the boiling point, reducing corrosion. We don't really talk too much about water pump lubricants nowadays because we have modern materials, but there are substances in there for that, and there are compatibilities between all these chemistries, these chemicals, so that they'll react with each other if you mix them and cause all kinds of unintended side effects. It's like the drug commercials on TV, You don't want all those side effects. Talk to your doctor first. But in this case, don't mix them. Don't talk to the doctor. Just don't mix them.
And something that's foaming, like you have up there, or bleeding the system out, something like an airlift is good.
Iron protection.
Yep.
We're going to get in a little bit into some of the chemistry, a little more about that, but the bottom line is you don't have to memorize this stuff. What you have to understand is it's there, and it affects how that engine lasts and how it cools. All right, here's a summary. Ethylene glycol, that's really what's out in all the OEM fills. Propylene glycol can be sold to you by some salesman, and it's really not recommended. I don't recommend it at all. It can't handle the heat, for starters. Less harmful to pets. They tell you it's not toxic at all. Give me a break. It's a chemical. It is harmful. OAT was the old technology, the green stuff, Prestone from the 70s, whatever. Hybrid is the kind of the new dominant technology. Comes in a variety of colors. The color is only a dye. Actual ethylene glycol is clear. It's colorless. You have all these, different additive packages for these manufacturers, and they all have their own specs, and the specs have changed over the years. As a rule, I think it's pretty much universal, this rule. Every manufacturer that's come up with a new spec has made sure that it was totally backwards compatible with their old stuff. Unlike oils, where there might be a little difference, with the coolants, I'm sure that's actually true. They meet all the old specs. All right, coolant-related problems: cavitation, corrosion, erosion, electrolysis, which is electrical activity that's caused just by the motion. Scale, which is usually some kind of a chemical reaction. And here we get into some of the show and tell stuff. Corroded water pump. We've all seen this. This water pump had no impellers left on it at all. It has the star shape, but the upright parts are totally missing. It wasn't pumping anything. All right?
And I've seen that in a few vehicles.
I've seen them with parts of them. And of course, with modern cars, we have the plastic impellers. VW has them, BMW had them, and you end up with compatibility issues. Some of the time, that stuff isn't breaking just because the plastic was garbage, which it was, but some of the time it was breaking because people put the wrong coolant in and it weakened the plastic. It made it brittle.
Right, or added, or put some additives in.
And put some additives in so there were solids or precipitates or things that it couldn't push, and it was flexing that thing and breaking it. All right, reduce coolant flow and overheating. We can get corrosion. I mean, this is stuff we kind of know, basic stuff. You don't want problems with it. There's an impeller with pitting, that's cavitation. The bottom line is there are pits in the impeller, and that happens because it's not just coolant makeup, it's pressure also, it's flow restrictions. You end up with such a big pressure change that there's air bubbles in there, and they literally explode on the surface. Exploding air bubbles cause damage.
And by the way,
sounds crazy.
If you're using something like an airlift or a machine like a Flow Dynamics, whatever, that fills them up, takes the air out, and you keep getting bubbles, it's due to cavitation, you have a part that's been damaged due to people putting the wrong stuff in.
And you have to look for why there's air getting into that system.
Right.
You may have a hose clamp or something that's letting air get sucked in on some low pressure area. You might have a problem with a radiator cap, common problem. Whatever it is, you're aerating your coolant, and it's a problem.
Yeah, look for collapsed hoses, which sometimes will tell you you have a bad cap. Is one of the things that is good to take a peek at.
Right, yeah. This is the phenomenon I was talking about. The air bubbles are exploding. It sounds crazy, but it's been proven to be extremely dangerous to materials. In fact, they use it in manufacturing to cut materials. All right. Diesel wet sleeve cavitation, same thing. You're actually chewing up the motor. Very bad. You don't want to be the shop that did the work.
And very expensive on a diesel.
And very expensive on a diesel. That's very expensive on anything. More so on a diesel. All right. This shows the chemical reactions between different metals. Again, we don't really need to know this other than to understand that it happens. Corrosion, decomposition of a metal. Again, we kind of all know this stuff. Galvanic action. Doesn't need outside electricity, and it's chemical in nature. It's a chemistry issue, whereas electrolysis is a action issue. All right, this is they call it bimetal corrosion, but I've always called it dissimilar metals corrosion. You have these different materials that are incompatible with each other. Magnesium on one side and platinum on another are the two ends of the spectrum in manufacturing. These are the two materials that react most violently by themselves with no outside force if you were to put them together. You never want to put those two together. All right, electrolysis requires an outside source of power, of electricity. So obviously if you have some kind of a bad ground or whatever, that just makes it worse. One of my favorite tools, refractometer for testing your coolant or actually your acid protection for a battery. Very accurate, maintains its accuracy.
Way better to use than those ball things, that's for sure.
Better than a hydrometer, much better than a hydrometer. Okay, coolant tests. Visual inspection, freeze point, pH. You have to use the strips or a meter, they make meters. Coolant voltage in the system. And you got to make sure that you don't reverse the leads. We get into that. And then there are miscellaneous or fleet concerns. Specific to a manufacturer or the way a car is operated. Police cars get different duty, or ambulances. You have to understand your market. Refractory image. Here's the refractometer, and you read it where the dark or the light, I should say, goes to dark. And you read it off a scale based on whatever the liquid is you're reading. It's very easy to use. All right, these are test strips, kind of a litmus test type of thing, if you remember that from like high school chemistry. Been around for quite a while and very good. And the good thing about this is you can show it to your customer.
Ah, that's what the quick oil change places do, and that's how they sell stuff.
Where a refractometer, it's a little harder to show to your customer.
Right.
This you can take it out and show it to the customer. Put it in front of them and say, see, this is bad.
I know Craig uses it in his shop,
Right.
along with a couple other things, which is a good show and tell.
Show and tell. We like our show and tell. Customers buy that. They trust you. They may trust you anyway, but they trust you more when you can prove it.
Exactly.
Printouts are very good for that too, and in other areas. Okay, so there's pH. There's a machine that the meter that does it. Again, if you could save this, you could do it. Otherwise, you have to take the meter out and show it to the customer. Can you trust this? Well, I don't. They've been around a long. Within certain limits, they're kind of okay, but they're really not the best technology. Voltmeter. You end up, in this case, we're testing for galvanic action or electrolysis. So if the voltage is less than 200 millivolts, you could have galvanic action. But if it's over that, the engine's running, now you have electrolysis. Electrolysis is a much faster process. It's how they electroplate things. Unfortunately, you're electro-deplating parts of your motor. and you might buy a motor. Okay, radiator voltage. Connect the negative voltmeter to the battery negative. Put the positive lead into the coolant with it running. All right? A reading of 300 millivolts, that's 0.300 volts, or greater indicates that there is corrosion occurring. But watch this. If we reversed it, as we did here, let me go back. Here we have the red lead in the coolant. We have the black lead on a good ground.
What's your meter reading there, Pierre?
It's reading 0.141 volts or 141 millivolts.
That's a good system.
Which is good, because 300 millivolts is the threshold. All right, here we have them reversed. I have a black lead in the radiator. I have the red lead on battery positive, and we have 12.373 volts. We have most of system voltage reading here. This is an invalid test.
So that's important.
That's normal. You would read that.
So it's important to put the correct leads, the negative on the battery,
On the battery negative.
and the positive in the antifreeze,
And the
not
positive,
the reverse.
That is correct. And it's running.
That's a very important test, I guess.
Yep. Okay. Coolant replacement. 15 to 20% stays in the system after it's been drained. That's why I say you got to really clear it as much as you can. Clear it till you got a lot of water in it. Run it a few times. Be aggressive. You have to be able to charge for this. You have to sell the customer on it. Don't do the quickie job, because you're not going to get what you want out of it. Fill the system with antifreeze first and top off with water is one way. I don't like to do that. I take cans, mix them 50-50. I write 50-50 on the cans. You can buy pre-mixed that are already done. But I don't like the idea of, if I have an empty system and I know it takes 3 gallons, I'll pour a whole gallon in and a whole gallon of water in, and I'll use a gallon, the mix. But otherwise, I use the pre-mix, so I always know I got 50-50. And if I have to add a little, I'll add a little pure coolant, because it's 50-50 to 60-40 is the range that you want. The ideal range.
Including your overflow bottle.
Including the overflow bottle. And you have to then run it and purge any air or use an airlift. You have to make sure that it's clean. If it's a system that's resistant to that, you may have to take it for a good test drive up a steep hill or whatever it takes.
Well, crack those bleeders and make
Crack
sure
the
you
bleeders,
warm
whatever
them up with that little electric heater nowadays. That works good.
Yeah, whatever it takes. Run the air. The heating system may have an auxiliary water pump that you have to make sure the heating system's turned on, because it may not run through there without that pump running and turn the heat up max. All right. GM says don't reuse the coolant drain from the system. I think that's a general rule. Pierre recommends don't reuse coolant. If you take it out, throw it out.
Gone.
It's like the old rule about spark plugs. If you drop it twice. The second time in the garbage can. In this case, don't use coolant again. Drop it in the recycling. All right. Check pressure cap and the radiator for faults, for problems. You got to check coolant, all the hoses. You got to look for, in some cases, You have hoses that are electrochemically resistive. They are coated or they're made up of materials that resist electrical activity. Jerry was pointing, and it's right on the hose, ECR, with a lightning bolt in it. It may say it on it in some kind of print. Sometimes they're hard to read, but it's on it.
Yeah, usually you'll see Gates, and whether they're CarQuest or Napa or whoever,
Right.
they'll have that on, and other brands as well.
Right. Ford specs. Yellow colored Motorcraft Premium Gold engine coolant. That meets this spec. Got to read these specs. They have different engine families coming from different parts of the world nowadays. You got to make sure you're using the coolant for the engine you have in your vehicle.
So wow, one manufacturer with 3 different colors there.
Yes, 3 different colors, 3 different specs,
Right.
all Ford, because they're a global company. And they might have an Asian engine and a European engine or an engine that came out of Brazil, or it could have come from the US, it could come from anywhere.
Yeah.
No? You have to read the specs. Again, just make sure it's for the vehicle you're working on. These are all a bunch of specs. Again, you don't have to memorize this stuff. What you have to do is look it up on a chart and make sure that what you've got, that coolant, that jug, or that drum, meets the spec for what you've got in your bay.
Yeah, look at all those specs there.
I'll go back again. You look at them all. Bunch of specs. And look, GM, 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 GM. It's all GM. But
Yep.
different specs. All right. Universal Gold. I love Universal. Not really. I'm not a big believer in Universal anythings. They're trying to make it so there are less part numbers and they're coming up with this stuff. But again, read the specs.
In fact, some good articles by Paul Weissler in the Mobile Air Conditioning Society stuff he did a while back. You can look that up. Some very, very good information.
Very good information.
Or check SAE, Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE.org.
They have a lot of good papers on this stuff. Oftentimes they're written in engineer language and you have to...
Pick the pepper.
And maybe drink 2 cups of coffee before you read that. You know, okay. Universal coolant. You know, I'm not a big fan of Universal anything. You know, that's it. I'm not a big fan of it. It's out there. You may try it, but you know, you're a test pilot. Okay. Passivization. I think I said that wrong. I always say that wrong. The bottom line is it's a chemical reaction that's part of the chemistry of the coolant. It's part of why you don't want to mix coolant. The coolant treats the metal surfaces inside that engine to slow down the corrosion process. It's the corrosion inhibition process, but they use different chemistries. Different chemistries, even maybe in the same manufacturer, from one date to another. They make changes in their coolants, and that changes the passivization, and they're not compatible with each other. Again, what you really have to know is don't mix this stuff, flush the car, put the right stuff in. This process doesn't happen in a second. It's a chemical process that occurs as the vehicle is driven, but it happens quickly after it's changed. Again, don't change packages. Flush it out. Same thing, I'm going to say it, I say it over and over again. All right. Coolant recovery and storage. All right. Some shops reuse antifreeze. I've already said it. I don't like it. The only thing I ever liked to do with antifreeze was put it in the drum so it could be sent for recycling. If a manufacturer reuses the ethylene glycol, I trust their engineers and their chemistry to make it a good base product first and add their additive package. But once you're doing it in your own shop,
Yeah,
it's very hard to have quality control.
And they'll have a warranty on it.
And
also, don't flush this down any sewers or anything.
Don't flush it down storm drains. Notice the double container. Make sure it's pumped out by a certified provider of this service.
That leaves you a manifest.
And leaves a manifest, because you are liable for these things cradle to grave.
That's right.
And it's actually better, in my opinion, to use a company that has their own remanufacturing facility, because as soon as they've remanufactured it, that's the grave. You're not liable anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Flushing a dirty system. This is all kind of basic. Flush it, flush it, flush it, and put in the right stuff. Don't mix nothing. All right? You got to clean stuff out. Make sure it's all empty, make sure it's all clean. If it's got crud in it, take the damn thing off and flush it out. All right. Many shops use machines. I'm unsure about how good this is. If you have one brand of coolant and you're very careful and you keep it clean, I suppose you can get away with it. As soon as you start mixing, all bets are off.
Yeah, drain your machine out.
Yeah, drain it out. You got to watch that stuff. Proper fill, you got to make sure that you bleed it out. The bleeder screw, air lifts are good, or any other technology like that that drains it, that cleans out all the, takes out all the air. Use a spill-through funnel that it makes it so that you have this fluid cap over your system so it pushes all the air bubbles out. The idea is fill it completely, get all the air out, and make sure it's clean. Use bleeder valves. You just got to make sure it's bled. Got to be pure. Dye's a good way to find leaks. I love UV dye. Good stuff.
Make sure it's the right dye, I guess.
Make sure
right?
it's the right dye for your system. Make sure that your goggles that you're wearing are the same frequency so you can actually see it. Because different brands use different frequencies. Different frequency black lights, different frequency, different color yellow or orange goggles. They use different stuff. Read between the lines. I don't think I have to read all of this to you, but the bottom line is manufacturers have their own specs. Different models and years of vehicles have their own specs. There's a lot of chemistry. We don't have to memorize it other than understanding it may not be compatible with each other.
And I guess it's in our handout anyway, I see. So
and it's in the handout. You can read this stuff, but I don't have to really list it all for you. Check service information. You want to look at the recommended intervals? I don't trust this recommended interval thing. I like to be aggressive. One of the things I'm doing for customers is I'm recommending something based on my experience. My experience is not necessarily the same as what the manufacturer wants. They want to sell you new cars.
But that's how you get 200,000-300,000 miles out of your vehicle.
That's how you get big mileage, is by being aggressive and by being careful with what you put in there. Check the cap, look at the appearance, use your eyes. I'm not going to say taste it, that's bad. And look for pH again, freeze point, boiling point. Questions and answers. Are all green antifreezes the same? Obviously, no. Can Dexcool be replaced with conventional green coolant? Yes, but then you got to flush it all the time, and you got to worry about whether you flushed out the old stuff properly, because you have these compatibilities that can be very damaging. Can they be mixed? Absolutely not. Is Dexcool propylene glycol? No. Dexcool and all the other coolants are ethylene glycol. No propylene glycol. Summary. Not all coolants are the same. Not all tap water is good. Premixed coolant usually produces good results. You got to check boiling point. You got to check pH. You got to check freezing point. And you got to check pressure caps. And it's not just Dexcool. It's everything, but especially on Dexcool vehicles.
And I guess we should also say you have to make sure you get all of the water or flush out of the coolant system to get a good fill.
Actually, Jerry brings up a good point. If you're using a flush, a chemical flush, you got to make sure that stuff is gone. Can't leave any of that. Waste the water. Use the water.
Yeah.
Get rid of it. Flush it out. Make sure it's all clean. All right. By the way, I just took apart a Bmw engine with 265,000 miles, my own vehicle. That was a 93 that I've been using my own advice on for its whole life. And the coolant passages looked like new. No damage, no corrosion, no nothing. Looked beautiful.
Use the right stuff and did the maintenance, right?
Yep, use the right stuff, did the maintenance. And it's beautiful. Didn't stop me from breaking an exhaust valve when I floored it though. Other fluids. Power steering fluid. Wide availability of universals. Again, be careful on this. This is not really, part of the regular discussion here, but I like OE fluids whenever possible, and if not, you're kind of a test pilot. I do test pilot occasionally, but be aware of that. VW Audi requires Pentacin mineral oil. You got to read the cap or read the spec on this. They have the early ones were CHF 7.1. The later ones are the synthetic 11S. You got to make sure you got the right one. They're both green. No manufacturers require power steering flushes for warranty reasons. However, just be aware, most manufacturers today have a filter that's replaceable in some form in their power steering, and there's no real stated interval for most of them. Sometimes it's the whole canister, sometimes it's a replaceable filter. Bottom line is, you have to use your own kind of
Discretion.
experience. I usually say 75, 100,000, some high mileage. At some point, you recommend changing the filter, however it's done, and flushing the system and putting maybe a couple of hoses. Certainly, if the thing develops a leak, recommend replacing.
Yeah, and flushing it out's
And
not,
flush it out. In
not
fact,
a bad idea.
here's on the 202 is a kind of there's a very narrow window of what it's used in. 7.1 is a non-synthetic, and 11S is a synthetic, but they're both green, and they're not compatible with each other.
And the same thing even over there, the Napa and the Run Right stuff.
Right.
You know, you got to be careful. Make sure it meets like Honda spec. Honda is very fussy with power steering
Just
fluid.
like I said with coolant, just like I said with engine oil. Read the spec, read the label. Don't use stuff if it doesn't have the spec on the label. Don't believe the salesman who says, this is good for everything.
Yeah, and use your
Nothing's
sensors.
good for everything.
Use your senses. If the fluid looks cooked or it smells,
It is cooked.
yep.
That's it. All right, transmission fluids. There's a lot of opinions on this. Transmission fluid is a wide availability of universals. You have to be careful. You got to be careful of warranty. Pretty much anything you use that's not OE is going to avoid a warranty. That said, BG and Run Right have low-cost universals, and I actually like a lot of the chemistry that these companies have. LubeGuard is well known in the industry. They have tremendous additives, and pretty much every transmission guy I know likes LubeGuard products, but there are different LubeGuard products.
That's right.
So you have to make sure you're using the right one for your application.
And someone like Wayne Colonna and ATSG, they'll tell you,
They know it well.
yep, use the correct loop guard by using their chart
But
with the correct fluid, and it'll work.
And it works great.
Yeah.
It works great. But, be careful. All right. Use only Honda ATF for Honda. Look up the specs and all data in Mitchell, or if you have factory information, you can go to nastf.org and get the factory links to all the factory websites, and you can get all the specs from the factories. They have a lot of stuff published.
Just a note
online.
on that Honda, guys that rebuild trannies, some of our members, Mike and Pete and Kevin, they'll tell you that Hondas are real finicky. Even though LubeGuard's a great product, you're going to be real careful. It's better off probably use the Honda
Use a Honda fluid.
or that synthetic that they have there. Seems to work okay with the modifier.
In my current Volkswagen world, that's true of the DSG transmissions as well.
Yeah.
That's their kind of standard automatic transmission, and those babies are picky, and we've been changing valve bodies, and you don't want to play with it.
Right.
You got to put the VW fluid in that case. All right, transmission fluid. If you do a flush, and the vehicle shifts badly, put in the OEM. If there's any kind of an issue, put in the OEM. If you're not sure, put in the OEM.
Is that a Honda bottle
That
up
says
there?
Honda Genuine HG. There you go. Jerry's just mentioning it. Honda Genuine fluid. They bang you for some money, but as a professional, you got to put the right stuff in. And you mark it up. You get whatever your discount is. You got to do the right thing. Bmw Gm Transmissions. This is something that you should be aware of. There's a sticker on the transmission for a part number, BMW part number. It says you can't use Dexron. It says it's incompatible with Dexron, and yet you can use Dexron. So you have to be absolutely sure that if you switch it over to Dexron, which you can do, my personal car has it in there, my wife's car has the Dexron in it, you must flush it a few times. If you can't get it all out of the torque converter, you flush it, you run it a little bit, you drain it, you put more in, you do it again, you take it for a ride and make sure everything moves and pumps itself out, drain it again. You may do it 2 or 3 times to make that switch.
Or you do, like the Flow Dynamics machine.
Or if you use a
Flush it
machine,
really good.
or obviously if you've taken the transmission apart for some reason and it's dry, that makes it easier actually.
Just more expensive.
But you've already had an issue at that point.
Right.
Just be aware you can't mix those two fluids that are both compatible with the transmission. Can't be mixed. Okay, resource materials. Professional Technician, Automotive Engines. This is a Jim Holderman book. This is a Tom Birch book, Automotive Heating and Air Conditioning. And certainly we encourage you to buy their books. And here's a plug for TST. Please come to our website and come to our seminars and maintain your professionalism. Thank you very much.